Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jared Naude. I'm going to talk about how you can build your own network threat feed and how you can use that for proactive defense. But first, a quick introduction. I head up security at Synthesis. We're an AWS premier partner. We help organizations adopt cloud securely. In my free time, I do research on cybersecurity topics that intersect with national security and foreign policy, things like disinformation, surveillance, nation-state activity, etc. I also help run community events like this one and a few others. And yeah, it's always great to give back to the community. So if you're a network defender, and on the blue team, on the blue team operating in a cloud environment, you know that securing the cloud environment can be quite challenging, and securing just a single cloud environment can be quite challenging. But as many organizations move to a multi-cloud world, this is becoming significantly more challenging. And then when you start adding in all of these third-party SaaS services that a lot of us are using, this becomes quite a major headache. And when you start looking at securing these vendors, many of them will have secure defaults or managed rule sets and policies that you can enable, which is a good starting point. However, in a mature security environment, this is often not enough, and often these services lack the granularity that you need in order to protect them properly. So, and a lot of these services will often push the burden of security onto the various security teams through monitoring. So instead of having granular control, there's kind of this focus on doing monitoring instead of trying to prevent like bad things from happening. And often what you'll notice is that often the self-hosted version of some of these platforms actually have more granularity than some of the cloud and SaaS versions of these platforms. So for example, Bitbucket is a really good example where the on-premise version has a lot more granularity from a control perspective, but then you kind of trade off all of the 0 days and CVEs that are present in those stacks. So a lot of these vendors will have out-of-the-box rules and policies that you can use to enable the securing of your environment. And these rule sets are often tied into third-party threat feeds. A lot of perimeter vendors also allow you to import external threat feeds into these devices. However, when you start looking at the big picture, the challenge that you have is that you land up with a lack of consistency and visibility across your environment. So for example, you might have a secure default or a managed rule set that protects you against a certain emerging threat, but another vendor or platform doesn't have that, so you kind of have a bit of a hole in that. And this is particularly problematic in the cloud space in particular. And a potential way to fix this is to actually use a threat feed to actually build some actionable controls to kind of gain a bit more consistency, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in a moment. So when we start looking at building your own threat feed, the first step is really to look at your own internal data to understand what's going on in your environment, and then we'll talk about how you can then use external data to kind of complement that. So the first good thing to look at is network data. So in order to observe what's happening on a network, we can collect netflow, which shows network events that are occurring on a specific network. There are specific vendor formats, but most of them can be converted to a generic netflow version. And this includes source and destination IP addresses, ports, etc. And from that data, we can then import this into a SIEM or a log analytics a tool where we can visualize the data and investigate it or interrogate it further as we need to. This data will also show you what devices are connecting to other devices in the network, both from an internal and external perspective. And this is very helpful to visualize network traffic flows, but it can also be used for performance monitoring and capacity planning as well. And from there, you can also get a sense of the geography that you are seeing traffic from. From a hyperscaler perspective, a lot of them have a version of NetFlow called FlowLogs, which is similar to NetFlow, but it has some different information and sometimes operates in a different way. And this data is very helpful if you have an incident. So you'll know exactly what devices have communicated to other devices by looking at this data. And if you use security groups properly, this is a great way to detect a compromised machine. So, for example, if a machine is compromised, one of the first things an attacker is going to try and do is to try to recon, and that's a really high quality signal that that machine needs further investigation. So when you combine NetFlow with application and authentication logs, you can now start building your internal threat feed data to understand the real world attacks that are actually happening in your environment. And then next, we want to see how we can combine that data with open source data. So there is a lot of publicly available open source and community feeds. And this includes SANS, abuse.ch, NetWatch, and others. There's also several companies that provide this data free of charge on an open source kind of basis. And a lot of this data is gathered through honeypots and other mechanisms of malicious behavior. This includes credential stuffing, brute forcing, vulnerability scanning, spamming, and a bunch of other malicious activities. And the SANS provides probably the most or the highest collection of threat feeds for this information, or for this malicious activity. This includes scanners, emerging threats, Tor nodes, and more. And this data is particularly helpful if you want to correlate what you're seeing in your internal data versus what's actually happening on the internet. So, for example, if you see a certain port is now getting scanned, you can go look at the threat feeds to see, is it specific to you or is it happening across the internet? Then there are sites like malware URL that list IP addresses and domains associated with malware. There are also several GitHub repositories that track open proxies, reverse proxies, and Tor nodes and other potential malicious infrastructure. One of the Git repositories is this project called NetWatch, which is a community project. So they run a whole bunch of sensors around the world that look at attacks that are happening, and they publish this data on a daily basis, and you then get an understanding of various IP addresses that are performing this traffic or these attacks. And then there are several commercial companies like Proofpoint that provide some threat feeds and rule sets that you can download and implement on your firewall. In a lot of cases, the companies only provide the rule sets, but then you can create processing to actually pull the data out of those rule sets. So there is a little bit of work involved in that. So once we have a list of threat feeds, what we want to do is we really want to build a combined list where we use the internal data along with the open source data, and then we can then process that. And what we want to do is we want to have this data in a unified format so that we can use it. Some of the challenges is that a lot of these feeds are not in a common format, so you actually have to do quite a bit of processing to extract information out of it. There's a lot of false positives. It's difficult to correlate between different threat feeds. Some of the threat feeds don't have context. So, for example, if you see a spike of certain behavior, you might not know why that's the case. You might need to investigate further, but sometimes you might not know why certain things are actually happening. And then another problem, which is very kind of specific to South Africa, is that a lot of these feeds are very US and EU centric. So we don't have a lot of good data around emerging threats happening in Africa, the Middle East, and South America. So inside of these threat lists, there's normally a bunch of IP addresses. That IP address will normally belong to a net block, which is normally larger than a /24. And that net block will be owned by an autonomous system number, or ASN. Companies can have multiple ASNs. So, for example, Facebook will have 4, Vodafone has 4, MTN has 2, and China Net has multiple. And what we want to do is we want to add this ASN information onto the IP addresses. Now, some threat feeds will automatically include the ASN data, but some of them don't. And the ones that you don't, you need to look that up, that information up. And what we want to do when we look this up is we want to get the other net blocks, affiliated telecom domains, the country, and the ASN that's affiliated with that specific IP address. And these lookups can be achieved through various open source data sets, but you can also use an IP lookup service as well. So once we have processed the data, we now have this in a unified format. And then we can start analyzing that data. So we can look at how many threat feeds are reporting on a single IP address and maybe add some kind of scoring along with that. And then we can also look at it from an ASN perspective to see which ASN actually has the most or the highest number of IP addresses that are performing malicious activity. And when you look at the data, you'll often see a lot of bulletproof hosting providers in these feeds. So if we look at analyzing kind of the data further, when you start plotting the locations of these attacks, I think to nobody's surprise in this room, you generally see the Asia Pacific region, and it's not just Russia and China, right? So it's also attacks coming out of cloud providers in Singapore and Japan as well. Singapore, for some reason, is a favorite location that's used to attack cloud infrastructure in Ireland and in other regions as well. And what you also notice when you start doing this analysis is that a lot of the threat feeds actually don't overlap. So, for example, you might have malicious infrastructure trying to brute force something, but you might not actually see that infrastructure in some of the other threat feeds. And this is one of the benefits of having a combined threat list. So let's look about how we can actually use this for proactive defense. So from a defensive or blue team perspective, we can use this data to enrich SIEM data. We can correlate internal threat data with what's happening on the internet. And then we can use it as a high quality input into actionable controls to reduce our attack surface. So as one example of how you can use this, scans for vulnerable infrastructure often come from bulletproof hosting providers. So one of the things that you can do is actually consider blocking these ASNs on your network perimeter. And if you run your own ASN, you can actually go to your upstream providers and maybe ask them to actually filter some of these malicious providers out. This is actually the official recommendation both from RAP and IANA that you should look at ASN filtering as well. Obviously, you do need to be careful that you don't accidentally block residential networks in the process. Now, you might say, this is actually, a bad idea. Maybe we can't block ASNs, but what you could potentially do is use it in a kind of a layered approach. So from a public perspective, you might want to do like a challenge on a website or something, and then on a third-party system, if you see a login from one of these ASNs, you can then generate an alert, and then maybe on your internal systems, you could completely block it outright. This obviously depends on your risk tolerance as an organization. And one thing to also look at when you are doing filtering, don't just look at the ASN itself, but look at the both upstream and downstream providers of that ASN. Often a lot of these malicious ASNs typically reside with each other because they use the same telco infrastructure. So when we look at it, blocking this from a zero-day perspective, you can actually reduce your attack surface quite significantly. So if you do have a zero-day in one of your network appliances, it gives you that little bit of extra time to actually patch it, and does actually reduce the chances that you might get compromised. One thing to keep in mind is that the prevalence of pre-auth RCEs is becoming a lot more common. And by blocking these ASNs, you do get that a little bit of additional time, and it is an additional layer of protection that you can have on your network. When we look at it from a nation state perspective, like the overwhelming majority of companies are not going to be the target of a deliberate APT attack. However, if you are familiar with China cyber operations, you know that they have a desire to build out operational relay boxes or orbs through vulnerable perimeter devices. So they might not be interested in your network, but they might be interested in where your network can get them. And by adding this control, it is a small but meaningful control to potentially prevent this activity. Then lastly, looking at how we can actually deploy this. So we can actually build a deployment process where we take this data, combine it into a threat feed. We can then use infrastructure as code to actually implement these controls. So Terraform is quite common in a lot of companies, especially in South Africa. And this can be done through either a manual process. You can create some kind of thing to actually script out the Terraform. Or if you're feeling fancy, maybe you can use an LLM with some RAG so that it can generate the Terraform for you. And once that's done, then you can deploy high quality controls using this data across your environment. So while not all of the services have the ability to support these kind of controls where this data would be useful, it does allow you to use threat data in kind of a meaningful way to ensure that you have a bit of consistency across your environment and across your platforms. Thank you very much.